I've always been an only child, relishing the solitude that my parents, both busy doctors, were frequently away, leaving me alone in our echoing halls. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I found comfort in it, or at least I did until that unnerving winter of 2018. It was a bitterly cold January evening, the kind where frost seemed to seep through the walls. I was 16, accustomed to being by myself, but that night felt different. The house seemed to groan more loudly, the shadows stretching more ominously. I shrugged off the unease, attributing it to the storm brewing outside. I decided to make hot chocolate, a little comfort against the cold. As I waited for the milk to heat, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound. It seemed to come from below, deep within the house. Our basement was a place of childhood fears, a dark, damp space I avoided. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a stray animal that had found its way in. The scratching continued intermittently over the next few days. Curiosity finally overcame my apprehension. Armed with a flashlight, I ventured down the creaking steps to the basement. The air was musty, thick with dust and long-forgotten memories. I shone the light around, half expecting to see glowing eyes of some wild animal. Instead, I found something far more unsettling, a makeshift bed in the corner, old blankets piled atop a worn mattress. My heart raced. Someone was living in our basement. I ran upstairs, every horror story I'd ever heard replaying in my mind. Dialing 911, I reported the situation, my voice trembling. The police arrived swiftly, searching the house. They found no one, just the eerie remnants of an uninvited guest. They suggested it might be a homeless person seeking shelter from the cold. They promised to patrol the area and advised me to keep the doors locked. The next few nights were restless. Every sound was magnified, every shadow a lurking figure. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of not being alone. My parents, concerned, suggested I stay with a friend or relative, but I refused. This was my home. I wouldn't be driven out by fear. One evening, as I sat in the living room trying to focus on a book, I heard it again. The scratching, but this time accompanied by a soft, muffled weeping. It was coming from the basement. My pulse hammered in my ears as I crept towards the basement door. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, wondering if I should call the police again. But a strange resolve took hold of me. I needed to face this, to end it. I descended the stairs slowly, the weeping growing louder with each step. As I reached the bottom, the flashlight beam fell upon a figure huddled in the corner. It was a woman, disheveled and ragged, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Who are you?" I stammered. Her story unfolded in broken, tearful segments. Her name was Sarah. She had been homeless for months, wandering from place to place. She had found the basement door unlocked one freezing night and took refuge, too scared to make her presence known. My fear gave way to a deep, unsettling pity. I offered her food and a chance to warm up before making any decisions. As she ate, I noticed her glancing nervously towards the basement stairs. She seemed more scared of something within the house than of being discovered. "What are you afraid of?" I asked. Her reply sent chills down my spine. She wasn't afraid of me or the police. She was terrified of something else in the house, something she insisted was lurking in the shadows, watching her, whispering at night. She described seeing shadows move, hearing strange noises, feeling a presence. Her terror was palpable, infectious. I wanted to dismiss her claims as the ramblings of someone who had endured too much hardship, but something in her eyes, a raw, unfiltered fear, resonated with my own unease over the past few days. That night, I lay awake, pondering her words. The house was silent, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. It was a sensation of not being alone, of sharing my space with an unseen entity. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to stay awake and watch. As the clock ticked past midnight, I heard it, a faint whisper like a hushed conversation. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. My heart pounded as I followed the sound, finding myself once again at the basement door. The whispers grew louder as I descended. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation. I reached the bottom, my flashlight scanning the darkness. That's when I saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, shifting along the wall. Panic gripped me. I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam dancing wildly. The shadow moved, fast and fluid, disappearing behind the old furnace. I heard Sarah's voice in my head, warning me of something unseen, something malevolent. I raced upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a trick of light, a figment of my imagination, or something far more sinister? Sleep was impossible. The following morning I called my parents, my voice barely concealing my terror. They listened, alarmed, and promised to return home immediately. When they arrived, we searched the basement together. There was no sign of Sarah, no trace of the shadow. My parents were concerned but rationalized it as stress and an overactive imagination. But I knew better. The house, once a haven of solitude, now felt oppressive, its secrets lurking just beneath the surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that the unseen tenant of our basement was still there, watching, waiting. As we sat in the living room that evening, trying to regain a sense of normalcy, a cold draft swept through the room. We heard it then, a soft, almost inaudible whisper, echoing through the halls of our old creaky house. The truth was undeniable. We were not alone. It's strange how the mundane moments in our lives can so swiftly spiral into abject horror. My story, which now haunts my waking hours and my sleepless nights, began on an utterly average day. I am an ordinary man, or at least I was, living in a mid-sized apartment building in a nondescript city. My life, defined by the unremarkable rhythm of a 9-to-5 job, was as plain as the beige walls of my one-bedroom apartment. The first sign that something was amiss came on a lazy Sunday afternoon. I remember it vividly. The sun was lazily drifting towards the horizon, casting long shadows across my living room. I stood by my window, coffee in hand, gazing absent-mindedly at the building across the street. That's when I first noticed him, a man standing at a window directly opposite mine. He was motionless, staring right at me. Initially, I thought little of it. City living means being in close proximity to strangers, after all. But as days turned into weeks, I began to notice him more and more. He was always there, always watching. His presence became a constant in my life, an unnerving shadow that loomed over my daily routine. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe he enjoyed looking out the window as much as I did. But deep down, I knew there was something off about him. His gaze felt too intense, too focused. It was as if he wasn't just looking at me, but studying me, learning my habits and routines. One evening, curiosity overcame my trepidation, and I decided to wave at him. He didn't respond, just kept staring. That's when a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't normal behavior. The next day, I kept my blinds closed. I hoped that out of sight would mean out of mind. But things took a darker turn. One night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. I lay in bed, frozen, as the tapping continued. Gathering my courage, I peeked through my blinds. There he was, the man across the street, tapping on his window while staring directly into my apartment. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me. That was the moment when fear truly took hold. I reported him to the police, but they said there was little they could do unless he posed a direct threat. I felt helpless, a prisoner in my own home. The climax of this nightmare came one fateful night. I had managed to fall into a fitful sleep when I was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. Heart pounding, I leaped out of bed and flicked on the light. There, in my living room, was a rock with a note tied around it. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "I'm coming for you." Panic engulfed me. I called the police, barely able to speak. Within minutes, my apartment was swarming with officers, but he was already gone. They searched the building across the street, but it was empty. The man had vanished without a trace. I moved out the next day, leaving most of my belongings behind. The fear of him finding me again was too great. I stay with friends, never in one place for too long. The fear has never left me, and it never will. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about him. Who was he? Why did he choose me? But the answers elude me, lost in the shadows of my memory. The most haunting part, though, is the realization that he's still out there, perhaps watching someone else from a darkened window. and I can't help but feel a chilling sense of guilt for whoever might be his next unsuspecting victim. When I was around 13, my parents began trusting me to stay home alone. They had been doing this since I was about 11. My mother always insisted I never answer the door or the phone when alone, but I often ignored this rule, especially if I thought a friend might be calling. This story unfolds on a chilly Saturday afternoon. My father was out of town on business, and my mother had gone to visit my aunt, leaving me to my own devices. I was sprawled on the couch, engrossed in a video game, when the doorbell echoed through the house. Initially, I ignored it, focusing on my game, but the persistent ringing drew me reluctantly to the window to investigate. Peering through the blinds, I spotted a man in his 40s, clad in a green jumpsuit with a vague logo and a badge I couldn't quite read. He caught sight of me and waved, trying to appear friendly. "Hello there. We've had reports of a water pipe issue in the area. Can I come in to check your pipes?" he called out. A wave of unease washed over me, but the idea of a water problem sounded serious. With trepidation, I unlocked the door, still cautious. He introduced himself as Mike and started talking about potential water damage. I mentioned offhandedly that my mum would be back any minute from the grocery store. Just as Mike started asking more questions, I noticed Mrs. Thompson, our neighbor, walking her poodle across the street. She looked over and seemed puzzled to see me with a stranger at the door. Sensing something off, she began crossing the street towards us. The moment Mike saw her, his demeanor shifted. He quickly excused himself, claiming he needed to grab a tool from his truck, and hurried away. Mrs. Thompson, concerned, approached and asked who that was. After I explained, she immediately called my mum, who rushed back and contacted the police. We later learned from the water company that there were no issues reported in our area, and they had not sent anyone. The realization of what could have happened left me shaken but grateful for Mrs. Thompson's timely intervention.